All right, welcome back. As you saw on our first video, as an introduction to this book and to our little channel, I've asked my publisher, Alex Barbas, to join us by phone. Alex is on the phone. Are you there, Alex?
Yes, I am. Hello, Christian. How are you?
I'm fine. Nice to talk to you.
Yes, likewise.
And so I asked Alex if he would join us so that we can give a little discussion about the book and about some other good work and good content maybe we can provide on this channel. And then I want Alex to talk briefly about some other titles that are available from his publishing house that might be of interest to people, especially those in the Catholic world. So with that, I'm holding a copy of the book here, The Pearl of Great Price, which Alex was kind enough to publish earlier this year. It came out in early February. It's available on Amazon right now. It's also available on Alex's website, and he can give us the information on that. But we wanted to talk first, before we get into any kind of salesmanship, about the book, the content, and I thought Alex, as the publisher, would be a good person with whom to have a dialogue. So, Alex, again, thank you for publishing the book. What would you like to discuss about it?
It really was a joy to first receive the manuscript. I read it and I thought, wow, what a book to publish. So it's a great drama that I think the Catholic world, and really anyone, will enjoy. So it really is a wonderful book. No, I was very happy to publish it.
Well, thank you. Do you want to have a little discussion about it?
I could ask. I don't know if you wanted to say a few words before, but basically, tell us about the book. I mean, what prompted you to actually write the book?
Well, the book is, although it's a short book and it only covers a short period of time, it's actually the product of a lot of thinking and reading that I've done over the past number of years. Particularly, I would say, from around the time that Pope Benedict issued his great decree Summorum Pontificum, which was the decree that I know with which you're quite familiar, that allowed the traditional Latin Mass to return to a place of normalcy and primacy in the church. And when he did that, it had a great impact on many people, including myself, as a person who was always attracted to the traditional Mass and the traditions of the church. And I began to wonder quite seriously, or think quite seriously, about broad questions of history, such as how did the church end up in the position in which it is in today? And how did the world in general end up to be the modern world that it is today? And so I began to read rather deeply about those topics, about the Enlightenment, about the Reformation. And when I came to the French Revolution, I really became fascinated by how much of our modern life and modern political thinking took shape in that revolution, both for good and for ill.
Yeah.
And as a subset of that, I discovered these incredible stories of what happened to the church in that time and what happened personally to two popes, Pius VI and Pius VII, his successor, at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th centuries. I had only heard little bits about these pieces of history over the course of many years, although I considered myself fairly well versed in church history. I really didn't know much about what happened to Pius VI and Pius VII, and I realized that much of the world doesn't know about what happened to them.
Just to interject a little, I know I didn't, so this was totally new to me. Not that I'm, the most well-versed in church history, but
think when people realize that not just one but two successive popes were arrested, basically tortured in various ways, taken prisoner in the late 1700s and the early 1800s, it comes as a surprise to people, especially given the way that, today the Pope is regarded as an international figure, something of a celebrity even. The idea that he could be captured and imprisoned, I think, shocks the modern consciousness.
That's an interesting point because the Pope, well, he's actually a head of state as well, and at that time he had probably more influence as, well, in a sense politically as well, controlling
Yes.
papal states. So it's like taking the president and arresting him, the president of the United States, another country taking the president of the United States, arresting him, et cetera, et cetera. It is shocking. You're absolutely right.
Yes,
very shocking.
That's not a bad analogy. And so I realized as I was reading this material that the stories of those two men were sort of lost to time. Pius VII is someone who was elected at the same time that Napoleon rose to power, and he has a rather long story of struggle with Napoleon that lasts the whole 15 or so years in which Napoleon is in power.
Okay.
Pius VI, whom we cover in this book, his crucible is of a shorter duration. He has essentially a 2-year period where he is the subject of a very difficult political and military circumstances. And I realized that, at least as a starting point, perhaps we'll go further as time goes on, but as a starting point, it was digestible to tell Pius's story because it's in a finite period of time. And so the book, as you know, is written as a play that tells the story of what precipitated Pius's problems and how they ended. From the time around Christmas of 1797, when a French general is accidentally killed in Rome, which gives the revolutionary French government the excuse it wants to come in and take over Rome. That happens throughout the course of 1798, particularly in the winter, and then from there, the French basically send the Pope into exile, and he ends up suffering through various forms of imprisonment until he dies, a prisoner of the French, in a city in southern France called Valence, where he ends up as a very sick old man confined to a bed. He dies there, and it ties in nicely because to the next phase in church history, because Napoleon actually passes through Valence on his way to Paris just before he takes full control of the country, and it's there that he meets the clergy who are with the Pope, who's now died, who cannot even secure the Pope's body to bring it back to Rome. And so there is a second part of the story, because Napoleon already sees that it's not right what's been done to the church and to the papacy, and so a dialogue then begins between Napoleon and the Roman clergy about how the church will be treated going into the 19th century. But the story in this book is the story of the invasion of Rome, the excuses used by the French to come to Rome, the extreme antipathy that revolutionary France, had against the church, the excuses, as I said, that it used, which really rings true in modern times when you think of World War II, for example, all of the various feints and excuses that Hitler used to break out of the treaties and to slowly and then quickly invade the countries around him. You see an antecedent of that in the way that the French behave. They are determined to wreck the Papal States and pull down the Pope because they regard the Pope as the great symbol of the Ancien regime, of the traditional world, and of the Christian religion, all of which they wanted to relegate to the dustbin of history. And they couldn't abide the fact that the church was an independent counterweight to their ideology. And so really the project of 1798 was to eradicate the papacy from the earth and to make Pius VI the last pope.
Wow. That's certainly dramatic. That's certainly dramatic, and it's amazing to read kind of the response of Pius VI to all of this. That leads me to another question. How would you describe really the character of Pius VI? Obviously, people need to read the book, but how would you describe him as a pope?
Well, it's interesting because Pius VI was, in many ways, the quintessential man of the old regime. He was an intellectual. He was a man of the sort of the Louis XV monarchical era. His predecessor had actually made certain reforms, like eliminating the infamous position of the cardinal nephew, which is sort of one of the famous abuses of the Renaissance. Well, Pius VI had a cardinal nephew. In fact, he's the last pope to have a cardinal nephew. So in some ways, in his early period, he was a bit of a throwback, even for the time, to a more princely approach to the papacy. And he has a very long reign, 26 years or so, which at the time was the longest since St. Peter.
Wow.
But interestingly, when pressed by the revolution, his inner spiritual nature emerges. And that always surprises me, because I think people are given to believe that these popes or prelates of the past were not really spiritual people, but were mostly worldly, power-hungry types. And I don't think history really bears that out, because if that had been true, Pius and a lot of people around him could have made all sorts of accommodations with revolutionary France and other hostile actors. So when pressed, Pius becomes a person who is defiant, even against his own, personal health and safety. He will not give on what he sees as the essential character of the church, its independence, its spiritual prerogatives, and he's particularly determined that the papacy continue, that he have a successor, and that the rights of the Pope, both the temporal and the spiritual rights, must continue, not because I don't think that he believed that he wanted to have temporal power, but because he believed that he was only a temporary custodian of both the spiritual power and the temporal power, that belonged to the patrimony of the church, and it wasn't his to give away. And so he would not yield, even as an 80-year-old man under quite a bit of physical duress, he would not yield. So I think that surprised even the people of his time, because he was not seen that way earlier in his life. As I said, he was seen as more a man of the world, a political person, a princely figure, and they wrongly assumed that meant that he didn't really have a spiritual depth. But that is not the case. And certainly in the last years of his life, he behaves in a very heroic manner and really regards himself as a servant of the traditions of the church. He regards himself that he is not free, even if he wants to give away what belongs to the church, belongs to St. Peter, not to any one person who may occupy the chair of Peter for a limited period of time.
I think that's a great point. That's really well said. I think one of the old, correct me if I'm wrong, one of the older titles of the Pope is actually being a servant. I think servant of the servant of God.
Correct. That's one of his oldest titles, the servant of the servants of God.
That's remarkable to see the spiritual depth of the Pope. When pressed, as you mentioned, that is incredible. But there's I can ask you so many questions. I had a question about, okay, so someone reads this. Now, would the reader, or rather, what do you think would be the relevance for, say, a reader today? Given kind of there's certain turmoil in the church. Reading this book, would that help them? I guess you've kind of already answered this, but would it help them kind of situate, today's, kind of ecclesiastical climate, by reading this book?
I think from the perspective of someone who reads it from the Catholic world, someone who's
right.
interested in it to understand church history in particular, and to try to grapple with what's happened to the church over not just the last decades, which is a constant topic, but really over the last centuries. This period is essential. I say in my author's note that these years are a kind of beginning for the self-understanding of the church in the 21st century. The reason for that is the calamities that befall Pius VI are so enormous that the rest of the modern era since then has been a series of reactions and counter-reactions to the modern world, and the sense that the modern world, whether you define that as the Enlightenment or democracy or modern political ideologies, are a threat to the church. When I was young, growing up, learning these things, being exposed to church history, my teachers essentially cast the church of the time before the Second Vatican Council as an irrational reaction against modern life. That they just didn't like it because they didn't like it. At least that's the impression that I got. And I think that a lot of people had, right? Stodgy people who just don't like modern stuff. But what I think you discover by reading this is, whatever truth there was in that other view, there were reasons that these things happened. They didn't just happen because it was a bunch of conservative, churchmen who hated democracy or the sexual revolution or whatever the bugaboo is. No, actually calamitous, momentous events happened to the church at the hands of these forces. And that's what colored the view, right? When you get to the point, the French Revolution was bad enough, and we can talk about that maybe in another segment. But when you get to the point, as the revolution is sort of culminating, that its forces are invading Rome and have taken the Pope prisoner and have announced their intention that he's going to be the last Pope, right? And that Christianity has to be eradicated. if you look at it from that perspective, you can start to understand why the church built up its defenses against those representatives of so-called modernity. That's where the whole notion of the fortress church comes from. It was built up against modernity because of these events. At least these are the first events, or the ones that really accelerate the building of the fortress. Many other things happen too that cause people to put more and more bricks in the fortress and close the windows throughout the 19th century. Then we have the famous calling of the Second Vatican Council, when it's alleged, not proven, that John the 23rd said he wanted to open the windows of the church, right? We have to open the windows and let the fresh air in. Fine. But maybe we forgot why the windows were closed in the first place. And all I am suggesting is, by now, in the 21st century, it's good to have a broad perspective. Not so that we can indict the Second Vatican Council and everybody associated with it, but so that we can understand why things happened, why there were reactions to the things that happened, and whether even well-intentioned actions were mistakes. And in part, they were mistakes, I think, because those actors forgot why the windows were closed in the first place. And by reading an account of these events, your eyes will be open. You'll say, oh, I see why the church was leery, even hostile to certain things in modernity. That doesn't mean that we should be hostile and leery of them forever, or to all things that concern modernity, but it does give you a context. It does give you a context to understand it, and I think then helps you make much better informed judgments about what can be accepted and changed and what should not be accepted and changed.
That's a very well-reasoned kind of explanation. I think you're right. Having this broad perspective is absolutely crucial. I think often those who read about the crisis, if you will, they have a very narrow view. They think, okay, everything was good back then, and then all of a sudden this event called the Second Vatican Council happened, and all these terrible things happened afterwards. But as you're pointing out, this actually has a long history, this reaction, and maybe the pendulum has swung too far now. But anyway, regardless of that, I think you're absolutely correct in how this book will give the reader a broader understanding, and hopefully it'll lead them to look at other sources as well.
And I want to make just one more point before we end, because you raise an interesting topic as well. You also see, I think, in this book, and if you read more about the times and events that surround the events told in the book, you'll see that the mistakes or bad ideas or wacky liturgical reforms, all the types of things that a lot of people, including myself, have been disturbed by over the years. They weren't invented in 1962 or 1969. In fact, these things were haunting the church a long time before that, and they were antecedent even to the French Revolution. And there is a marrying, in some ways, of those types of reforms with the political reforms that the church also didn't like. And so I do think it helps calm some of the roiling and the anger in the church, and the relentless focus on one period of time in the 20th century. I don't think that's healthy. I think if everybody could step back and see the journey of the church in time in a much broader context, it would, as I said, it would inform their judgments, and it might take the temperature down because of what you say, because people wrongfully, sometimes, not always, but sometimes paint an idyllic picture as if everyone was a St. Francis of Assisi and on his knees at Mass in 1959, and then that all got destroyed. Obviously, that's not true. A lot of the ideas that were not good were around a long time before that, and I think you can't really understand the whole picture, both the good and the bad, and judge the mistakes as well as some of the things that were not mistakes without knowing the modern history of the church and understanding how the revolution, the French Revolution that is, impacted it and the sort of trajectory it sent it on. And what I'd like to see happen is that people in our generation who care about Christianity and the life of the church would take these lessons and try to work out a settlement of this endless debate about the Vatican Council.
That's right. That's again, well said. So another question. So you mentioned his successor, Pius VII.
Yes.
Now, have you thought of perhaps writing another book? I mean, I guess it's too soon to maybe talk about that because we want to promote this book. But have you thought about it?
I have. As I said, Pius VII's story really deserves a full treatment. There's an excellent book, short book, and perhaps I'll bring it into another installment, by a man called E.E.Y. Hales, who was writing in the 50s into the early 60s. And he focused on this period, and a lot of my information came from him. He wrote a short book about the travails of Pius VII and Napoleon called The Pope and Napoleon. It's excellent. It's 60 or so years old now, but it really gives a very pithy, well-told account of this 15-year battle. Pius VII's story must be told. He's a fascinating man. He is mentioned in this book. He's a person who also, like Pius VI, struggled to try to find a way to live with these modern forces but preserve Christianity. In fact, Pius VII was somebody who was one of the few leading bishops in the church before he became the Pope, obviously, who said, no, Christianity and democracy can coexist. And he proffered the theory that democracy needs Christianity. The French had it the other way around, sort of saying that the gospel is based on democracy. And Pius VII, who was then Cardinal Chiaramonti, he said, no, democracy is based on the gospel. And because democracy connotes personal freedom, in order for people to properly exercise their freedom, they must be good Christians. Be good Christians and you will be good Democrats, was something he famously said in a sermon given at Christmas in 1797, just before all these troubles in Italy really got out of control. So he's a fascinating figure, very, very heroic man also, a very holy man. He was a Benedictine monk, a very mild man, but also a man who would not bend and break under Napoleon. He basically would not allow the church to become an arm of the Napoleonic system. And Napoleon was fine with there being a church as long as he was in control of it. And right. Pius VII was fine with Napoleon, but he wanted the church to be let alone to be the church. And Napoleon would not relent, and neither would Pius. And it sets up a fascinating battle. And I would just mention also, even after Napoleon's fall, and Napoleon really tortured Pius VII, it was to Rome that members of the Bonaparte family went, including Napoleon's mother, and Pius VII gave them refuge. And Pius VII was concerned for Napoleon's welfare on Elba and St. Helena when no one else could have cared what happened to him. So it's really quite a testament to his Christian soul that even after all that happened to him, he never lost compassion for him and for his family.
Well, that's fascinating. One thing that came to mind, and just quickly, is I don't know. This is kind of my understanding of these things, but how ferocious these revolutionaries were in the name of a supposedly liberal and tolerant attitude towards the world. It seems to me that's always the kind of the paradox or the contradiction with kind of these early liberals, revolutionaries really, but they promoted a kind of liberalism, if you will, but yet they were very violent.
Yes.
In many ways, very violent, especially towards the papacy.
Yes.
I find that dynamic pretty interesting.
It is interesting, and it is very, very relevant to our own time. It's a warning that we should take seriously because there are many, many elements of that in our present politics. Yes, they were convinced of the rightness of liberté, égalité, fraternity. Who could be against it? Liberty, equality, and brotherhood. What's not to like? And anybody who, as you know, who questioned it ran into a lot of trouble. And the history of the revolution, most of which predates the events told here, is a very sad and very cautionary history where of relentless violence, of a relentless attempt to impose this kind of an ideological enlightenment and paradise on people. And as they say, it always eats its own, and that is so true and borne out again and again in the French Revolution. And I do think that anybody who's concerned about the state of affairs in our politics today, you really have to be familiar with what happened in the French Revolution because it will inform you and it should chasten people. These things can get out of control. They start benign, in a benign fashion, and the French Revolution in many ways did. In fact, the church, without the church there would not have been a French Revolution. It was the clergy who sided with the common people in 1789 to essentially end the Estates General and to begin the movement towards allowing for a constitutional monarchy, the liberty, equality, fraternity ideas, all of that. That was made possible because the clergy conceded that the present French system was not working and was unjust. Now, that's the opening of the door, right? Everybody agrees the system's no good, right? Once that legitimacy is gone, it can become a very scary prospect. And what happened is almost immediately after the church had allied itself with the reformers turned on the church. And their almost immediate goal was to control the church and to make it part of the state and, depending on which group you were in, essentially to de-Christianize the country. And that is a constant theme of the revolution. It's a theme in this book, because by the time you get to this book, we're now at the period of the French Directory. You had one group of directors who were considered not radical enough, not anti-Christian enough. They're replaced with a new group, because there's constant revolution within the revolution. They're replaced with a new group, and this new group wants the church cooked, and they want the papacy done. When Napoleon invaded Italy in 1797, he took over large portions of northern Italy, including parts of the Papal States, but he did not march on Rome at that time. This greatly angered the French Directory. They wanted him to march on Rome and get the Pope at that time. Napoleon doesn't do that, and that is why the Directory is forced to look for another excuse to come back to Italy, and that's where this book starts. It's the death of a French general in Rome who is living with Napoleon's brother, who is then the ambassador to the Papal States. It's the death of this general that gives the French the excuse they want so they can come back and finish the work Napoleon hadn't done the year before, which is the eradication of the papacy. And of course, they start off by saying, "Oh, we're just going to come to, we have to arrest the evildoers, the people who killed our general," and that morphs into, "Actually, I'm sorry, we have to eradicate the Papal States, and we're taking the Pope prisoner." And it happens over the course of, several weeks or a month, where they go from, "Don't worry, we're here to help," "Don't worry, we're here to just capture the people who killed General Dupuy is his name, and that quickly morphs into, "Actually, I'm sorry, we're here to restore the ancient Roman Republic, and the Pope is now deposed, and we have to kick him out of Rome," and he ends up, as I said, journeying through northern Italy. Eventually, he's thrown out, put over the Alps, and he dies in France.
Wow.
So before we go, thank you for your questions. Before we go, I just wanted you to talk a little bit about the publishing house and some of the titles you have coming up.
Sure. Well, thank you. It's been a great joy to talk to you about your book. Along with Christian's excellent book, we've published quite a few books since I started in October. The publishing house is called Aroca Press.
Can you spell that, Alex?
I'm sorry?
Can you spell that?
Sure. It's a Portuguese city. AROUCA, and then press.com. That's our website. So some of the books that we've published, I'll name the first one. That's the book that started it all. Is the Book of Meditations from Antonio Cardinal Bacci. He's very familiar, I'm sure, to many of the readers. He was the Vatican's Latinist for many decades. Brilliant man, brilliant Latinist. And he published a series of very beautiful meditations for every day of the year. So I was fortunate to republish that book. Some of the other books. A book that's in some ways complementary to the book that Christian wrote is a new translation of Cardinal Biot's work on liberalism. It's a completely new translation, and it was done by Thomas Stork, who has written a lot about Catholic social teaching and
Yes.
other matters. It's a great book. It kind of shows the philosophy behind liberalism, and reading those two books hand in hand, I think, would be very helpful for understanding the kind of intellectual climate of that time. And of course, I think it has relevance for today. Some other books, I'm going to be publishing a book, Defending Marriage and the Family, and it's written by a Norbertine priest from St. Michael's Abbey. So that should be coming out very soon. And I have so many books. One other book, or books that I'm publishing, is the works of Carol Robinson, who was somewhat of an obscure author, but she wrote in the 40s, 50s, all the way up until the 70s. And she basically was a Thomist, and she tried to understand modernity as she saw it, and try to understand the interaction between the faith and daily life. So
Yes.
She's an incredible author, I think.
Yes.
As well, I published a book on the Church Fathers. I've published quite a few books, it's an ongoing thing. I have lots of time now to work on a lot of the books, but yes, just just go to www.arokapress.com, and you can see everything there. I've kind of laid it out, some of the projects I'm working on.
Well, I hope some of the viewers will check that out. I hope you found our discussion interesting. We hope to bring you more content on these types of topics. I think all of them are fascinating, and for anybody who is interested not just in the spiritual life or in the life of the Roman Catholic Church, but in our whole political modernity and the climate in which we find ourselves, I think both my book and the books that Alex have mentioned would be extremely helpful to giving such persons a greater wisdom and understanding of the world in which we live. So, Alex, I want to thank you. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. I hope you'll check out Arouca Press. I hope you'll check out this book and the other titles, and we look forward to talking to you again soon.